The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Sarah Mitchell pushed through the heavy metal doors of the mess hall at Forward Operating Base Atlas. Her boots echoed against the concrete floor as she made her way to the industrial kitchen, tying her apron around her waist with practiced efficiency. To everyone on the base, she was just another face in the support staff, someone who showed up before dawn to prepare breakfast for the soldiers rotating through this remote outpost in the Afghan highlands. Sarah had been working in the mess hall for 3 months now, and she had perfected the art of being invisible. She kept her head down, her conversations brief, and her movements methodical. The other kitchen staff barely knew anything about her except that she was reliable, quiet, and made the best scrambled eggs anyone had tasted in a war zone. Some of the younger soldiers tried to flirt with her during meal times, but she deflected their attention with a polite smile and a quick retreat back to the kitchen. What none of them knew was that Sarah Mitchell wasn't really a cook at all. Her real name was Captain Sarah, and before she had traded her combat gear for kitchen whites, she had spent 6 years as a force reconnaissance Marine. She had operated in some of the most dangerous territories across 3 continents, completing missions that would never appear in any public record. Her specialty was deep reconnaissance and direct action, the kind of work that required equal parts intelligence, physical prowess, and the ability to become a ghost when necessary. The assignment to FOB Atlas had come through unusual channels. Intelligence had picked up chatter about a potential insider threat at the base, someone feeding information to local insurgent groups about patrol routes, supply deliveries, and security weaknesses. 3 convoys had been hit in the past 2 months with suspicious precision, and 2 soldiers had died in what should have been routine supply runs. The brass needed someone on the inside, someone who could observe without raising suspicion, and someone with the skills to handle a situation if it went sideways. Sarah had volunteered without hesitation. Going undercover as support staff was a far cry from the adrenaline-fueled operations she was accustomed to, but she understood the stakes. Every piece of information leaked from this base put American lives at risk, and if there was a mole, she would find them. The cover as a mess hall cook was perfect because it gave her access to nearly everyone on the base. Soldiers from every unit passed through her kitchen 3 times a day, and people talked freely around those they considered beneath notice. As she cracked eggs into a massive steel bowl, Sarah's mined everything she had observed so far. There were roughly 200 personnel rotating through FOB Atlas at any given time, a mix of infantry, support staff, and intelligence personnel. The base sat on a strategic ridge overlooking a valley that served as a crucial supply route. Losing control of this position would give enemy forces a significant advantage in the region. The kitchen began to fill with the other morning staff. Maria, a contractor from Texas who actually was a professional cook, arrived with her usual cheerful greeting. Behind her came Danny and 2 local Afghan men who had been working on the base for over a year. Sarah had cleared both of them through her own quiet investigation in the first few weeks. Their backgrounds checked out, their movements were consistent, and they showed genuine gratitude for the steady work that fed their families. The breakfast rush started at 0600 hours. Soldiers filed through in groups, their conversations a mixture of complaints about the heat, anticipation of going home, and the mundane details of military life in a combat zone. Sarah served eggs and listened, her trained ear picking out useful fragments of information from the general noise. She noted who sat with whom, who seemed stressed, and who was spending money they shouldn't have. Lieutenant caught her attention during the morning rush. He was a logistics officer, responsible for coordinating supply runs and maintaining inventory records. Over the past week, Sarah had noticed subtle changes in his behavior. He seemed distracted, checked his phone more frequently than regulations typically allowed in the mess hall, and had started taking his meals at odd hours when fewer people were around. It could mean nothing, or it could mean everything. As the breakfast crowd thinned out, Sarah began the cleanup process while keeping in her peripheral vision. He sat alone at a corner table, picking at his food without real interest. His phone was in his hand again, his thumb moving across the screen in a way that suggested he was typing rather than just reading. In a combat zone where operational security was paramount, that kind of behavior raised red flags. The morning routine continued with the preparation for lunch. Sarah fell into the rhythm of chopping vegetables, seasoning meat, and monitoring multiple cooking stations simultaneously. The work was genuinely demanding, and she had developed a new appreciation for the people who did this job for real. Her hands moved with efficiency born from 3 months of practice, but her mind never stopped analyzing. Around 1100 hours, Captain James entered the kitchen through the back entrance. He was one of only 3 people on the base who knew Sarah's true identity, serving as her official handler for this operation. To maintain her cover, their interactions had to appear completely natural, and played his part well by complaining about the coffee quality and requesting extra portions for a meeting he was supposedly hosting. As Sarah poured him coffee, he spoke in a low voice that wouldn't carry beyond the immediate area. Intelligence intercepted communications last night. They're planning something big, and the timing suggests they have current information about our patrol schedules. Sarah kept her expression neutral, focused on the coffee pot. The logistics officer, something's off about him, nodded slightly. We've noticed the same thing, but we need proof before we can move on anyone. The wrong accusation could compromise the entire operation and alert whoever might be working with him. I'll stay close to it, Sarah replied, handing him the coffee. Anything else I should know? There's a supply convoy scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. High-value medical supplies and ammunition. If the pattern holds, that's exactly the kind of target they've been hitting. Accepted the coffee and raised his voice to normal volume. Thanks for the coffee. Try not to burn the lunch today, okay? Sarah responded with an appropriately irritated look and left through the same back entrance he had used to enter. The brief exchange had given her the critical piece of information she needed. If there was going to be another attack, it would likely happen within the next 24 to 48 hours, and if was involved, he would need to pass along the final details soon. Lunch service proceeded without incident, but Sarah noticed that didn't show up at his usual time. She made a mental note and continued serving the long line of hungry soldiers. The afternoon shift was always chaotic, with people grabbing quick meals between duties and training exercises. The noise level in the mess hall rose to a constant roar of conversation, clattering trays and scraping chairs. After lunch, during the brief lull before dinner preparations began in earnest, Sarah took her break in the small storage area behind the kitchen. It was one of the few places where she could have a moment of privacy, surrounded by industrial shelves stocked with canned goods and dry ingredients. She pulled out her personal phone, a device that looked ordinary but had been modified with secure communication capabilities, and sent a brief encrypted message to about's absence from lunch. The response came back within minutes. Subject left base perimeter at 1300 hours with supply requisition team. Scheduled return 1700 hours. Sarah felt her instincts kick into high alert. Leaving the base, even on legitimate business, created an opportunity for face-to-face communication that couldn't be intercepted electronically. If he was the mole, this could be when he passed along the final details for tomorrow's convoy attack. She needed to be ready for when he returned. The dinner preparation kept her hands busy but not her mind. She worked alongside Maria, preparing enough food to feed 200 people while running through various scenarios in her head. If was compromised, there had to be a handler, someone on the outside coordinating with the insurgent groups. That person would be the real prize, the one whose capture could roll up an entire intelligence network. As 1700 hours approached, Sarah positioned herself near the mess hall entrance, ostensibly checking on the serving line setup. Through the windows, she watched the main gate where vehicles entered and exited the base. Right on schedule, a dust-covered Humvee rolled through the checkpoint, and she could see in the passenger seat. His body language was different from when he had left, more tense, and he kept glancing at his watch. The dinner rush began and appeared in line looking distracted and anxious. Sarah served him personally, making brief eye contact and offering a neutral smile. He barely acknowledged her, taking his tray to an isolated table near the far wall. For the next 30 minutes he sat there, eating mechanically while his eyes constantly scanned the room. At 1800 hours, a Sergeant Sarah didn't recognize entered the mess hall and walked directly to his table. The two men exchanged a few words, too quiet for Sarah to hear from her position behind the serving line, and then both got up and left together. The interaction lasted less than 2 minutes, but it had all the hallmarks of a prearranged meeting. Sarah caught's eye across the room. He had been sitting with a group of officers, maintaining his own cover, but she could see from his expression that he had noticed the same thing. She gave him the slightest nod, a signal they had established to indicate a significant development. The rest of dinner service felt like it took forever, but Sarah maintained her cover perfectly, serving food and making small talk with the soldiers who passed through her line. Inside, her mind was already shifting gears, preparing for what might come next. If and his contact were planning to act before tomorrow's convoy, they would need to move soon, possibly tonight. After the dinner cleanup was complete and the other kitchen staff had left for the evening, Sarah changed out of her kitchen whites in the small locker room adjacent to the mess hall. She pulled on dark cargo pants and a fitted black t-shirt, clothes that allowed for freedom of movement while still looking casual enough not to raise questions. Her military-issue sidearm was locked in a secure box in her quarters, but she had other resources available. The base was quieting down for the evening, with most personnel either in their quarters or at the small recreation area where soldiers gathered to decompress. Sarah made her way through the shadows between buildings, moving with the practiced stealth that had been drilled into her during force recon training. She knew the patrol routes, the blind spots in the security cameras, and the rhythms of the base after dark. Quarters were in the officers' section, a row of modified shipping containers that had been converted into basic living spaces. Sarah positioned herself in an observation point with a clear view of his door, settling in behind a generator housing that provided both cover and a legitimate excuse for being in the area if anyone questioned her presence. She didn't have to wait long. At 2100 hours, emerged from his quarters wearing civilian clothes, which was unusual for this time of night. He walked with purpose toward the communications building, a heavily secured structure that housed the base's satellite uplinks and intelligence operations center. Sarah followed at a distance, using the darkness and her knowledge of the base layout to remain undetected. Didn't enter the communications building, but instead circled around to the back, where he met the same sergeant from the mess hall. The two men stood close together, their conversation intense but quiet. Sarah crept closer, using a row of parked vehicles as cover until she was within earshot. "Everything's set for tomorrow," the sergeant was saying, his accent marking him as local, probably Afghan. 1600 hours, just after the convoy passes through the checkpoint at grid reference 7349. They'll hit the second vehicle first, disable it, then pick off the rest. His voice was strained, conflicted. "You promised no casualties. You said it would just be the supplies." The sergeant laughed, a cold sound without humor. "You're worried about casualties now, after what you've already helped us accomplish. The money's already been transferred to your account, Lieutenant. Your part is done. What happens tomorrow is not your concern anymore." Sarah's hand moved to her waistband, where she had concealed a compact tactical knife. She could take both men down right now, end the threat before anyone else got hurt. But years of training and discipline held her back. There might be others involved, more pieces of the network that would scatter if she moved too soon. And the sergeant had mentioned money being transferred, which meant there was a digital trail that intelligence could follow. She pulled back, melting into the shadows as the two men concluded their meeting. Looked like a man who had just sold his soul and was only now realizing the price. The sergeant walked away toward the motor pool, while stood alone for a long moment before heading back to his quarters. Sarah moved quickly to find, using their emergency contact protocol. Within 15 minutes, they were in a secure room in the intelligence building, the only place on base where they could speak freely without any possibility of being overheard. "We need to take them both tonight," Sarah said without preamble. "They're planning to hit tomorrow's convoy at 1600 hours. The sergeant is local, probably the direct link to the insurgent group." Was already on his encrypted phone, relaying the information up the chain of command. "We'll coordinate with base security and have teams ready to move within the hour. This is exactly what we needed." But Sarah felt a nagging doubt. It felt too easy, is compromised, guilty, and scared. But that sergeant showed no fear at all. He was confident, almost cocky. "I think there's more to this than just one officer feeding information." "What are you suggesting?" asked, lowering his phone. "I'm suggesting that we use tomorrow's convoy as bait. We take the sergeant into custody tonight, quietly, but we don't announce it. We let the attack play out, but we're ready for it. See who else shows up, how many people are involved in the network." Considered this, his expression grave. "That's risky. If something goes wrong, we could lose people." "We could lose more people if we don't root out the entire network," Sarah countered. "These attacks have been too well coordinated to be the work of just two men. There are others on this base helping them, I'm sure of it. This is our chance to get them all." The decision ultimately wasn't theirs to make, but their recommendation carried weight. By midnight, the plan was approved at the highest levels, and the sergeant, whose name turned out to be a supposed interpreter who had been on base for 8 months, would be taken into custody in a way that appeared to be unrelated to the convoy intelligence. Meanwhile, the convoy would proceed as scheduled, but with significant additional security that would remain hidden until the ambush was sprung. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Fob Atlas like a heavy blanket as Sarah stood in the armory, checking her gear with the methodical precision that had been ingrained in her through years of training. Gone were the kitchen whites and the unassuming demeanor of a support staff member. In their place was the full combat of a Force Recon Marine, from the plate carrier heavy with ammunition magazines to the suppressed M4 carbine that felt like an old friend in her hands. The armory sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Collins who was also read into the operation, watched her work with professional appreciation. He had served with Force Recon himself years ago and recognized the efficiency in her movements. She wasn't just putting on equipment. She was transforming herself back into the warrior she had always been beneath the disguise. "I set aside the good night vision for you," Collins said, sliding a case across the table. "Latest generation. You'll be able to count the hairs on their heads from 500 meters out in complete darkness." Sarah nodded her thanks and integrated the night vision device with her helmet system. The convoy was scheduled to depart at 1400 hours, which gave her 12 hours to prepare and position herself. The plan called for her to be inserted into an overwatch position in the hills above the ambush site 2 hours before the convoy would pass through. From there, she would have eyes on the entire operation and could respond to threats that the convoy's security team might not see coming. The briefing room was crowded when she arrived at 0500. Captain stood at the front with a detailed topographical map projected on the screen behind him. The assembled team consisted of 20 operators, a mix of Special Forces soldiers and Marine raiders who had been brought in specifically for this operation. Sarah recognized a few faces from previous deployments, and the acknowledgement in their eyes told her they recognized her too, though none of them had known she was on the base. Began the briefing without preamble. At 0300 this morning, we took both lieutenant and into custody. They're currently being held in isolation, and as far as anyone on this base knows, they're simply MIA. The story we're spreading is that they went out on an unauthorized patrol and haven't reported back yet. He clicked to the next slide, showing aerial imagery of the ambush site. Intelligence analysis of communications and contacts suggests we're looking at a coordinated attack involving between 15 and 20 insurgents. They've been staging equipment and personnel in this area for the past 3 days, which means they're committed to this operation. The map showed a narrow section of road that passed through a small valley, with high ground on both sides providing perfect firing positions for an ambush. It was a textbook kill zone, the kind of place where convoys got torn apart if they weren't careful. "Our convoy will consist of 4 vehicles," continued. 2 armored Humvees, 1 MRAP, and a supply truck. The visible security will be standard protocol, nothing that would alert the enemy that we're expecting trouble. But hidden in the supply truck will be 10 additional operators ready to deploy the moment the shooting starts. He pointed to several positions on the map. "We'll have 3 Overwatch teams in the high ground here, and here. Captain will be in position Alpha, the highest elevation point with commanding views of the entire valley. Teams Bravo and Charlie will flank the ambush site to the north and south." Sarah studied the map, committing every detail to memory. Position Alpha was a rocky outcrop about 800 meters from the road, with a steep approach that would require technical climbing skills to reach. It was perfect for her purposes, offering multiple firing lanes and good concealment. "The goal is simple," said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Let them spring the ambush, identify all participants, and then eliminate the threat completely. We want prisoners if possible, but the priority is protecting the convoy and gathering intelligence on the broader network. These people have American blood on their hands. We're going to make sure they don't spill any more." The briefing continued for another hour, covering communications protocols, contingency plans, and rules of engagement. Sarah absorbed it all while mentally reviewing her own preparation checklist. This kind of operation was what she had trained for her entire career, but the stakes felt particularly personal after spending 3 months serving meals to the soldiers whose lives depended on her success today. At 0700, Sarah made one last appearance in the mess hall kitchen. Maria was already there, starting the breakfast preparations, and she looked surprised to see Sarah in full combat gear. "Sarah, what's going on? Are you okay?" Maria's concern was genuine, and Sarah felt a pang of guilt for the deception she had maintained. "I'm fine," Sarah said, keeping her voice level. "There's something I need to take care of today. Can you handle breakfast service without me?" Maria's expression shifted from concern to understanding. She had worked on military bases long enough to know that not everyone was what they seemed. "You do what you need to do, honey. We'll manage just fine here. You just make sure you come back safe, you hear me?" Sarah gave her a quick hug, surprising both of them. "I'll see you at dinner service." The flight to the insertion point was scheduled for 0900, giving Sarah time to run through final equipment checks and review intelligence updates. The latest satellite imagery showed no obvious signs of enemy activity near the ambush site, but that was expected. These insurgents had proven themselves skilled at camouflage and fieldcraft. They wouldn't be easy to spot until they wanted to be seen. The helicopter insertion was smooth and professional. The pilot, a warrant officer with more combat hours than most people at driving time, brought the Black Hawk in low and fast, using the terrain to mask their approach. Sarah fast-roped down to a landing zone half a kilometer from her final position, her boots hitting the rocky ground with practiced ease. The helicopter was gone within seconds, disappearing back over and leaving her alone in the vast emptiness of the Afghan highlands. She moved quickly toward Position Alpha, using a route she had planned from studying the topographical maps. The terrain was brutal, all loose rock and steep inclines, but her conditioning was excellent. 3 months of physical training disguised as kitchen work had actually improved her endurance, and she made good time despite the heavy pack and equipment. Reaching the outcrop required a technical climb up a 30-foot rock face. Sarah secured her rifle across her back and started up, her fingers finding holds that had been shaped by thousands of years of wind and weather. The exposure was significant. A fall from this height would mean serious injury or death, but she moved with confidence born from countless hours of training on far more difficult climbs. She pulled herself over the final edge and immediately went prone, scanning the valley below through her rifle scope. From this vantage point, she could see almost the entire ambush site, from the entrance to the kill zone to the exit point nearly 2 kilometers away. The road was empty now, just a dusty ribbon cutting through the rocky landscape, but by this afternoon it would become a battlefield. Sarah set up her position with meticulous care. She arranged rocks to create a stable shooting platform and natural concealment, positioned her equipment for easy access, and established her range card, marking exact distances to key features in the valley below. At 800 meters, she was well beyond the effective range of most of the weapons the insurgents would likely have, but well within her own capability with the designated marksman rifle she had been issued. The hours passed slowly as the sun climbed higher in the sky, turning the rocks around her into radiating heat sources. Sarah sipped water from her hydration system and monitored the radio traffic from the other teams getting into position. Bravo team reported they were set at 1100 hours, followed by Charlie team at 1130. All pieces were moving into place. At 1300 hours, movement caught her attention in the valley. Through her scope, she watched as figures began emerging from concealed positions among the rocks and scrub vegetation. They moved with tactical discipline, setting up firing positions that covered the road from multiple angles. Sarah counted them carefully, noting their weapons and equipment. 15 so far, matching the intelligence estimate, but she kept watching because there was always the possibility of more. The insurgents were well equipped, she noted with professional detachment. She spotted at least 3 RPG teams, multiple PKM machine guns, and what looked like a rifle, probably a Chinese-made Type 65. These weren't untrained fighters. They were moving and positioning themselves like soldiers who understood combined arms tactics. Someone had trained them well. At 1400 hours, the convoy departed FOB Atlas right on schedule. Sarah tracked its progress through radio updates, visualizing the 4-vehicle column moving through the checkpoints and heading toward the valley. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger guard of her rifle, not yet on the trigger itself. Patience was as much a weapon as the gun in her hands. The wait was the hardest part, lying motionless under the intense Afghan sun, knowing that violence was coming but not knowing exactly when or how it would unfold. Sarah controlled her breathing, staying hydrated and maintaining her focus on the valley below. She watched the insurgents settling into their final positions, saw them checking their weapons and equipment, observed their command structure as a man who appeared to be their leader moved between positions, offering encouragement and final instructions. At 15:55 hours, 5 minutes ahead of schedule, the convoy entered the kill zone. Sarah could see them clearly now, 4 vehicles moving at moderate speed, maintaining proper intervals. To the insurgents waiting in ambush, they would look like any other supply convoy that had passed through this valley, completely unaware of the danger ahead. The lead Humvee was almost through the kill zone when the first RPG streaked across the valley. The timing was perfect, exactly as had described, aimed at the second vehicle in the convoy. The explosion was massive, the shaped charge warhead designed to penetrate armor, but the MRAP it struck was built to withstand such attacks. The vehicle rocked from the impact but kept rolling, and Sarah saw the turret gunner immediately return fire. Then all hell broke loose. Machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions, tracer rounds cutting through the air like deadly fireflies. The convoy returned fire with disciplined aggression, but they were outnumbered and caught in the prepared kill zone. This was exactly what the insurgents had planned for, and they pressed their advantage with ruthless efficiency. Sarah's finger moved to the trigger. Through her scope, she could see the insurgent commander directing his forces, still confident that this ambush would succeed like the others before it. He had no idea that he was being watched by a Force Recon Marine who could drop him from 800 meters away. "Alpha to all teams," Sarah spoke calmly into her radio. "I have eyes on 15 targets. Engaging commander first. Stand by for follow-up." She let out half a breath and gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle recoiled smoothly against her shoulder, and through the scope she saw the insurgent commander drop like a puppet with its strings cut. One shot, one kill, 800 meters in a crosswind. Her Force Recon instructors would have been proud. The reaction from the insurgent positions was immediate confusion. They knew someone had been shot, but they couldn't tell where the fire had come from. Sarah was already lining up her second shot, targeting an RPG gunner who was preparing to fire again. The rifle spoke once more, and the gunner collapsed. "Bravo and Charlie teams, you are cleared hot," his voice came through her earpiece. "Let's clean this up." What happened next was in coordinated combat operations. From their concealed positions, the Overwatch teams opened fire with devastating accuracy. The insurgents, who had thought they were the hunters, suddenly found themselves as prey. The 10 operators hidden in the convoy's supply truck deployed smoothly, establishing a defensive perimeter and adding their firepower to the engagement. Sarah worked her sector with cold precision, engaging targets in order of threat priority. Each shot was measured, controlled, and effective. She wasn't just shooting. She was conducting a symphony of violence, coordinating with the other teams to ensure that every insurgent position was covered and eliminated. An insurgent with a machine gun tried to reposition to get a better angle on the convoy. Sarah's round found him mid-stride, and he went down in a tumble of limbs and equipment. Another insurgent attempted to flee up a narrow ravine. She led him just enough to account for his movement, and the bullet caught him center mass. The firefight that the insurgents had expected to last hours was over in less than 10 minutes. When the shooting stopped, 15 insurgent fighters lay dead or dying in the valley below. Not a single American had been seriously wounded, though 2 Humvees bore the scars of RPG impacts and small arms fire. Sarah maintained her position, scanning for any additional threats while the teams below began securing the area. The convoy personnel and the assault teams moved through the insurgent positions methodically, checking bodies, securing weapons, and gathering intelligence materials. Every phone, every document, every piece of equipment would be analyzed for information about the broader network. "Alpha, this is," her radio crackled. "Outstanding work up there. We're going to need you to hold position for another hour while we complete the site exploitation. The QRF is inbound to help with cleanup and transport." "Copy that," Sarah responded, never taking her eyes off the valley. "I've got all day up here." But even as she maintained her watch, her mind was already moving to the next phase. They had won this battle decisively, eliminated a significant threat, and would gather valuable intelligence from the site. But the nagging doubt she had felt the night before was still there, stronger now. This had gone almost too perfectly, like they had been allowed to succeed. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the valley in shades of orange and red, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the dead insurgents was wearing a watch that seemed out of place, too expensive and modern for a rural fighter. She zoomed in with her scope, studying the body more carefully, and saw what looked like an American flag patch partially hidden under the man's tactical vest. Alpha, you need to check the body at position 7 Delta, the one near the overturned rock. Something doesn't look right. There was a pause before responded. Copy, moving to that position now. Sarah watched through her scope as and two other operators approached the body she had indicated. She saw kneel down, examine the body carefully, and then key his radio with obvious urgency. All teams, we have a problem. This insurgent is carrying American military identification. I repeat, we have what appears to be an American combatant among the insurgent force. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. The insider threat wasn't just the identification documents pulled from the dead man's pocket belonged to Sergeant First Class David, a logistics specialist who had been reported as killed in action 6 months earlier during a convoy attack near Kandahar. The official report had stated that his body had been recovered and sent home for burial, with full military honors given to a fallen hero. Yet here he was, or rather had been very much alive until Sarah's bullet had found him, fighting alongside insurgent forces against his former brothers in arms. The discovery sent shockwaves through the command structure. Within hours, FOB Atlas was locked down completely. No one in or out without explicit authorization from the base commander, Colonel, a career infantry officer who looked like he had aged 10 years since receiving the news. Sarah sat in a secure briefing room with a hastily assembled investigation team that included representatives from Army CID and CIS, and a shadowy figure introduced only as Mr. Harrison from an unnamed agency that everyone understood to be CIA. We've started a full audit of every service member reported as KIA in this theater over the past 18 months, Harrison said, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone who had seen too much and been disappointed by humanity too many times. Preliminary results suggest might not be the only one. We have at least 3 other cases where body recovery was incomplete or where remains were never positively identified. Colonel slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing in the small room. How in the hell does an American soldier fake his own death, join up with the enemy, and nobody notices for 6 months? Where were the safeguards? Where was the oversight? The safeguards depend on people doing their jobs honestly, Harrison replied. When you have insiders at multiple levels working together, they can manipulate almost any system. Wasn't just passing tactical information. He was falsifying reports, altering records, creating gaps in accountability that these deserters could slip through. Sarah had been quiet throughout most of the meeting, still wearing her combat gear, the smell of gunpowder lingering on her clothes. But now she leaned forward, her mind working through the implications. And couldn't have set this up alone. This kind of operation requires resources, planning, and infrastructure. Someone with significant authority has been orchestrating this, using compromised soldiers to build an intelligence network that goes way beyond simple information leaks. Nodded in agreement. The question is, who else is involved that we don't know about yet, was in that valley with 14 insurgents? If he's one of 3 or 4 American deserters, where are the others? The briefing room fell silent as everyone contemplated the disturbing possibilities. The threat wasn't just external anymore. It was internal, personal, and much closer than anyone wanted to admit. Trust, the foundation of military cohesion, had been shattered, and until they identified everyone involved in the conspiracy, no one could be considered above suspicion. We need to interrogate, and immediately, Harrison said, already standing. And I mean properly interrogate them with every tool at our disposal. They're going to tell us everything they know about this network, even if they don't think they know it. Sarah stood as well, feeling the weight of her equipment and the exhaustion of the day's events settling into her bones. I'd like to be part of those interrogations. I've been watching people on this base for 3 months. I might recognize connections or patterns that others would miss. Harrison studied her with the calculating gaze of someone assessing an asset's value. Your force recon, correct? Captain, I've read your file. Impressive record. Yes, you can sit in on the interrogations. Your observations could be valuable, and frankly, we need all the help we can get right now. The interrogation of Lieutenant began at 2200 hours in a windowless room deep within the intelligence building. Sat shackled to a metal chair, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. He looked like a man who had watched his entire life collapse and was only now beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistakes. His career was over, that much was certain. But whether he would spend the rest of his life in military prison or face capital charges for treason would depend on how cooperative he decided to be. Harrison took the lead, his approach clinical and methodical. "Lieutenant, you're going to tell us everything about the network you've been working with. Every name, every contact, every piece of information you've passed along. In return, I can make recommendations about your sentencing that might result in life imprisonment instead of execution. It's the only deal you're going to get, and it expires the moment I walk out of this room." His hands trembled as he looked around the room, his eyes finally settling on Sarah. He seemed startled to see her there, no longer wearing kitchen whites but full combat gear, a sidearm on her hip and an expression that conveyed zero sympathy. "You," he said, his voice cracking, "you're not really a cook." "No," Sarah replied flatly. "I'm not. And because you've been selling out your fellow soldiers, people I served meals to every day for 3 months, some of them are dead. So you'll forgive me if I don't have much patience for whatever justifications you think you have for what you've done." Flinched as if she had struck him, Harrison used the moment to press harder. "Talk to us, Lieutenant. Start from the beginning. How did this start?" The story that emerged over the next several hours was one of gradual corruption that began with what seemed like small compromises. Had gambling debts, serious ones, accumulated during a previous deployment. A local businessman named had approached him with an offer to clear those debts in exchange for minor information, nothing that seemed particularly sensitive at the time. Just basic details about supply schedules and patrol patterns that could supposedly help local merchants plan their business activities. But of course, it had never stopped there. Once had taken that first payment, once he had crossed that initial line, had owned him. The requests became more specific, more dangerous, and more valuable. Found himself trapped in a web he couldn't escape, each new piece of information he provided digging him deeper into a hole from which there was no climbing out. "Introduced me to about 8 months ago," said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He said could help coordinate information more efficiently, that he would be my direct contact moving forward. I didn't know was part of the insurgency until it was too late to back out." "Tell us about," Harrison demanded. "How does an American sergeant end up fighting with the insurgents?" Shook his head, looking genuinely confused. "I didn't know anything about. I never met him, never knew he existed. My involvement was just information, I swear. I passed along patrol routes and supply schedules, but I never knew about any Americans actually joining the insurgents." Sarah leaned forward, her instincts telling her that was telling the truth about this part at least. "But would have known. He was the connection between your information and the people using it. He would know about and any others." Harrison stood abruptly. "Get in here now." Proved to be a much harder subject. Unlike, who was a soldier broken by his own poor choices, was a true believer, someone who had been working against American interests with ideological conviction. He sat in the interrogation chair with defiant silence, refusing to answer any questions despite the various pressures Harrison applied. It was Sarah who finally got him to talk, though not through interrogation techniques taught in any manual. She had been studying him quietly while Harrison worked, nodding his tells and body language, the way his eyes would flicker at certain names or topics even as his mouth remained stubbornly closed. "You think you've won something," Sarah said suddenly, cutting off Harrison's latest question. "You think keeping silent makes you a hero to your cause, but you don't understand what's really happening here." His eyes met hers, and she saw the intelligence there, the calculation. He was smart, educated, and committed. This wasn't some random insurgent fighter. This was an operator who understood the game being played. "Is dead," Sarah continued. "And so are the 14 men who fought with him today. Your network has been completely compromised. Has already told us everything he knows, and right now, intelligence analysts are tearing apart every communication, every financial transaction, every connection in this entire region. Within 48 hours, we'll have identified everyone involved in your little operation." "Then you don't need me to tell you anything," replied, speaking for the first time since the interrogation began. Sarah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're right, we don't need you to tell us who's involved. But what we can't figure out without your help is why. Why would American soldiers turn against their own country? What were you offering them that was worth betraying everything they swore to defend?" There it was, the slight shift in his expression that told Sarah she had hit on something important. He wanted to talk about this, to explain the ideology and reasoning that had motivated his actions. People like true believers in a cause always wanted others to understand their perspective. "You Americans think everything is about money or power," said, his accent more pronounced now as emotion crept into his voice. "But some of us fight for ideas, for beliefs that transcend your materialistic worldview. Your soldiers who joined us, they saw the truth of what your country was doing here, the hypocrisy of your so-called freedom and democracy." Harrison started to interrupt, but Sarah held up her hand, silencing him. She needed to keep talking to let his pride and conviction overcome his tactical silence. "They saw that we were offering them something your military never could," continued, warming to his subject. "Purpose, real purpose, not just following orders from politicians who sit safe in Washington while sending young men and women to die for oil and corporate interests. We offered them a chance to fight for something that mattered." "How many," Sarah asked quietly, "how many American soldiers have you recruited?" Smile was cold and triumphant. "More than you know. More than you'll find, even with all your surveillance and investigations. We've been building this network for over 2 years and was just one piece of a much larger picture." The interrogation continued for hours, with providing bits and pieces of information, some useful and some clearly designed to mislead. But Sarah had gotten what she needed most: confirmation that this wasn't just about a few compromised individuals, but rather an organized recruitment effort that had been targeting American military personnel with systematic precision. By 0300 hours, Sarah was exhausted, but her mind was racing too fast for sleep. She walked the perimeter of Fob Atlas, needing the cool night air and physical movement to process everything she had learned. The base felt different now, no longer the relatively safe rear area installation she had known for the past 3 months. Every shadow could hide a threat, every soldier she passed could be another, bidding their time and waiting for an opportunity to strike. Found her near the eastern observation post, standing in the darkness and watching the distant mountains where the ambush site lay. "You should get some rest," he said, though his own appearance suggested he hadn't followed that advice himself. "Can't," Sarah replied. "Too many pieces that don't fit yet, talked about recruitment, about ideology and purpose. But was logistics. What if the whole desertion angle is a cover for something else?" Frowned, following her logic. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that if you wanted to steal military equipment and supplies without getting caught, having people in logistics who could falsify records would be incredibly valuable. And if some of those logistics people could fake their own deaths and disappear into the local population, they could facilitate large-scale theft, while everyone thinks the supplies were lost in combat." The implications made Curse under his breath. "We need to pull every logistics record for the past 2 years, cross-reference reported losses with actual combat activity, and see if there are patterns that suggest systematic theft. I'll bet we find that most of the supposedly destroyed or captured equipment was actually diverted and sold," Sarah said. "This isn't just about intelligence gathering or ideological recruitment. This is about money, probably millions of dollars worth of military hardware that's been stolen and sold on the black market." As the sun began to rise over Fob Atlas, Sarah and presented their theory to Colonel and Mr. Harrison. The investigation expanded immediately, bringing in additional personnel from military intelligence and criminal investigation divisions. Over the next 72 hours, the pattern became impossible to deny. Nearly $15 million worth of equipment, ammunition, and supplies that had been reported as combat losses over the past 18 months had actually been systematically stolen and diverted to black market sales. The network was larger than anyone had initially suspected, and were low-level operatives in an organization that included at least 8 compromised American service members, 3 local contractors with connections to insurgent groups, and a mysterious figure known only as the banker, who coordinated the financial aspects of the operation. Sarah knew that finding the banker was the key to dismantling the entire network. Everything else was just cutting off tentacles. They needed to kill the head of this particular beast. And based on the financial sophistication of the operation, the banker had to be someone with significant resources, connections, and possibly official cover that allowed them to move freely between the military and civilian worlds. The answer came from an unexpected source: Maria, the actual cook who had worked alongside Sarah in the mess hall. She found Sarah during breakfast service on the fourth day after the ambush, pulling her aside with obvious nervousness. "I probably should have mentioned this earlier," Maria said, wringing her hands. "But there's this guy who comes around sometimes, a contractor who handles food supply deliveries. He's always asking questions about the base, about personnel, about schedules. I thought he was just making conversation, but after everything that's happened, I got to thinking maybe his questions weren't so innocent." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "This contractor, does he have a name?" "Michael Graves," Maria replied. "He runs a logistics company that handles supply deliveries to several bases in the region. Real smooth talker, always very generous with cash bonuses for the kitchen staff. I never thought much of it before, but now." Now it made perfect sense. A civilian contractor with legitimate access to multiple military installations. Someone who could coordinate deliveries and pickups without raising suspicion. Someone who would understand both the military supply chain and how to exploit its vulnerabilities. Michael Graves, if that was even his real name, was almost certainly the banker they had been looking for. Sarah immediately relayed this information to Harrison, who ran the name through every database available. The results were deeply troubling. Michael Graves existed on paper, with all the proper business licenses and contracts, but the man himself was a ghost. No social media presence, no photographs in any official records, no traceable personal history beyond the business he supposedly ran. "He's using a legend," Harrison said, using the intelligence community term for a false identity. "This level of operational security suggests professional training, probably intelligence background. We're not dealing with some opportunistic criminal here. This is someone who knows exactly what they're doing." The hunt for Michael Graves became the investigation's primary focus. Every delivery record was scrutinized, every witness who had interacted with him was interviewed, and surveillance was established at every location his company was known to operate. It took 5 days of intensive investigation, but eventually they caught a break. Graves was scheduled to make a delivery to Fob Atlas the following week, a regular supply run that he had been conducting for over a year. It was the perfect opportunity to grab him, to bring down the entire network in one coordinated operation. But it would require perfect execution and absolute secrecy, because if Graves suspected anything was wrong, he would vanish and they might never find him again. Sarah volunteered to be part of the takedown team, and this time there was no question about whether she would be needed. Her cover as a cook was blown within the investigation team anyway, and her skills as a force recon operator made her an obvious choice for an operation that could turn violent in an instant. And the plan to capture Michael Graves was elegant in its simplicity, which was exactly what made it dangerous. Simple plans relied on everything going exactly right, with no room for the kind of complications that combat operations always seem to generate. Sarah had been through enough missions to know that no matter how well you prepared, reality had a way of throwing unexpected variables into the mix. The delivery was scheduled for 0900 hours on a Tuesday morning, which gave them 6 days to prepare. The team assembled for the operation consisted of 12 operators, including Sarah, and a mix of special forces and military police personnel who had been thoroughly vetted to ensure there were no more compromised individuals in the chain. Harrison would coordinate from the intelligence center, maintaining overwatch through the base's security camera system and providing tactical updates as needed. Sarah spent those 6 days reviewing every aspect of the operation, running through scenarios in her mind, and identifying potential weak points in their plan. The biggest challenge was that they needed to take Graves alive. Dead men couldn't provide information about the rest of the network, couldn't testify in court, and couldn't lead them to whatever resources and assets had been accumulated through 18 months of systematic theft. But taking someone alive was always more complicated than simply eliminating a threat. It required precision, timing, and the ability to dominate a situation so completely that resistance seemed futile. Sarah had done it before in operations across 3 continents, but it never got easier. The human variable, the unpredictable element of how someone would react when cornered, was impossible to fully account for no matter how much you planned. The day of the operation arrived with clear skies and the kind of heat that made body armor feel like a sauna. Sarah was positioned in the mess hall, back in her kitchen whites for what would be the last time, maintaining the appearance of normal operations while the tactical team was staged in concealed positions around the delivery area. To anyone watching, it would look like just another routine supply delivery, right up until the moment they made their move. Graves arrived exactly on schedule, which somehow made Sarah more nervous rather than less. Punctuality suggested discipline, and discipline suggested someone who wouldn't be easily surprised or overwhelmed. His truck, a large commercial vehicle bearing the logo of his logistics company, rolled through the main gate after the standard security check and proceeded to the designated delivery area near the rear of the base. Through the mess hall window, Sarah watched as Graves stepped out of the truck. He was in his mid-40s, fit and alert, with the kind of situational awareness that came from professional training. His eyes constantly scanned his surroundings, noting the positions of personnel and vehicles, identifying potential threats or escape routes. This was definitely not some civilian contractor who had stumbled into criminal activity. This was an operator, someone who had been doing this kind of work for a very long time. The local workers who normally handled deliveries approached the truck to begin unloading, unaware that half of them had been replaced by undercover MPs who looked the part, but were armed and ready to respond at a moment's notice. Graves supervised the unloading process, checking items against his manifest and making small talk with the workers, his demeanor relaxed and professional. Sarah moved to the back door of the mess hall, positioning herself to have a clear view of the delivery area while remaining concealed. Was in position on the opposite side, and the rest of the team was distributed in a loose perimeter that would tighten like a noose at the predetermined signal. Everything was proceeding according to plan, which was exactly when Sarah's instincts started screaming that something was wrong. Graves had paused in his inspection of the delivery, his attention focused on something near the truck's cab. His body language had changed subtly, a slight tension in his shoulders that suggested heightened alertness. "All teams, this is Alpha," Sarah spoke quietly into her radio. "Subject may be suspicious, stand by." Graves reached into the truck's cab, and for a moment Sarah thought he might be going for a weapon. Her hand moved to her concealed sidearm, ready to respond if the situation turned violent. But instead of a gun, Graves pulled out a phone and made a call, his expression neutral as he waited for someone to answer. Harrison's voice came through Sarah's earpiece. "We're intercepting the call now. Give me 30 seconds." Those 30 seconds felt like an eternity. Sarah watched Graves through the gap in the doorway, nodding every movement. He was still maintaining his cover, still acting like a normal contractor conducting routine business. But there was something in his eyes that suggested the wheels were turning behind that calm exterior. "Alpha, we have the intercept," Harrison reported. "He's calling his office to report the delivery is proceeding normally. No indication he suspects anything." Sarah wasn't convinced, but there was nothing concrete to justify aborting the operation. Graves concluded his call and returned to supervising the unloading, which was nearly complete. According to the plan, they would make their move once the truck was empty, and Graves was preparing to depart, catching him in a moment of transition when his attention would be divided. The last crate was removed from the truck, and Graves walked around to the driver's side door, carrying his clipboard and appearing ready to leave. This was it, the moment they had planned for. Gave the signal and the net closed with professional efficiency. "Michael Graves, you need to stop right there and put your hands where we can see them," called out, his weapon drawn but pointed down in a non-threatening posture. "We just want to talk to you." For a fraction of a second, Graves froze, his mind clearly processing this unexpected development. Then his training kicked in, and he moved with a speed that caught even Sarah by surprise. Instead of reaching for a weapon or trying to flee, he lunged back into the truck's cab and started the engine, his hand slamming the vehicle into gear even as operators rushed toward him from multiple directions. Sarah was already moving, sprinting from the mess hall toward the truck with her sidearm drawn. She saw Graves's intention a heartbeat before he executed it, saw him calculating angles and trajectories, planning his escape route through the chaos he was about to create. The truck lurched forward, not toward the main gate where security would stop him, but toward the motor pool area where multiple vehicles were parked in tight rows. Graves was using the truck as a battering ram, smashing through a fence and scattering personnel who dove out of the way. It was a desperate move, one that showed he understood capture meant the end of everything he had built. "All teams, subject is mobile and attempting to breach the perimeter." Harrison's voice was urgent in Sarah's ear. "Gate security, do not let that truck leave the base." Sarah ran at full sprint, her conditioning allowing her to close the distance despite the truck's head start. She could see Graves through the side window, his face set in grim determination as he navigated between parked vehicles and supply containers. The truck clipped a Humvee with a screech of metal on metal, but kept going, heading toward a section of fence that looked less substantial than the main barriers. And two other operators had commandeered a Humvee and were in pursuit, but the truck was faster and more maneuverable than its size suggested. Graves clearly had experience driving in combat conditions, using terrain and obstacles to his advantage as he zigzagged toward the perimeter. Sarah made a split-second decision. Instead of continuing to chase on foot, she altered her angle, cutting across the motor pool to intercept the truck at the fence line. It was going to be close, very close, but if she could reach that point before Graves did, she might be able to stop him. She ran harder than she had ever run in her life, her lungs burning with the effort, her legs pumping like pistons. The truck was bearing down on the fence, 70 meters away, 60 meters, 50. Sarah reached the fence with seconds to spare and did the only thing she could think of that might work. She aimed her sidearm at the truck's front tire and fired 3 rapid shots. The tire exploded with a loud bang, and the truck immediately began to lose control. Graves fought the steering wheel, trying to compensate, but physics was against him. The truck veered sharply to the right, tipped onto 2 wheels for a heart-stopping moment, and then slammed back down with enough force to shatter the windshield. The truck came to rest against a concrete barrier, steam hissing from its damaged radiator. Sarah approached cautiously, her weapon trained on the cab, ready for Graves to emerge fighting. Behind her, she could hear the pursuing Humvee screeching to a stop and operators deploying to establish a perimeter. But when Graves finally stumbled out of the truck, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, his hands were empty and raised in surrender. The calculation in his eyes had shifted. He knew the game was over, and whatever training he had received had apparently included knowing when to quit. "I want a lawyer," were the first words out of his mouth as operators surrounded him. "I'm not saying anything without legal representation." Sarah lowered her weapon but didn't holster it, watching as Graves was secured with zip ties and searched for weapons. They found 2 handguns, a knife, and what looked like a backup phone hidden in various locations on his person. This was definitely not some ordinary civilian contractor. The interrogation of Michael Graves began 3 hours later, after he had been medically cleared despite his protests that he needed immediate hospitalization. The cut on his head required 4 stitches but was otherwise superficial, and the base physician had declared him fit for questioning. Graves sat in the same interrogation room where and had been questioned, but unlike them, he exuded confidence rather than fear or defiance. Harrison led the interrogation with Sarah observing from an adjacent room through a one-way mirror. They had decided that her presence in the room might compromise the interrogation since she had been the one to shoot out his tire and stop his escape. Better to let Harrison work while she watched and analyzed. "You should know that we've already dismantled your entire network," Harrison began, his voice conversational. "Is cooperating, has provided us with detailed information about recruitment operations, and we've recovered financial records that show the full scope of your theft operation. The only question now is whether you want to help yourself or whether you want to go down for everything." Graves smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You're bluffing. Is a coward who knows just enough to be dangerous to himself and is an ideologue who thinks he's fighting a holy war. Neither of them knows anything about the actual organization because that's how I designed it. Compartmentalization is basic operational security." "Then educate me," Harrison said, leaning back in his chair. "Tell me how it really works, because from where I'm sitting, you're looking at multiple life sentences for treason, theft of government property, conspiracy to commit murder, and about a dozen other charges. Your only chance at seeing daylight again before you're 90 years old is to cooperate fully." "I want immunity," Graves replied flatly. "Full immunity from prosecution in exchange for information about the network and testimony against everyone involved. And I want it in writing from someone with actual authority to make that deal." Harrison shook his head. "Immunity is off the table. You facilitated operations that got American soldiers killed. There's no deal good enough to make that go away." "Then I guess we have nothing to discuss." Graves crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, the picture of someone prepared to wait out however long this took. Sarah had seen enough. She left the observation room and entered the interrogation room, ignoring Harrison's surprised look. Graves's eyes tracked her movement as she pulled up a chair and sat down across from him. "You're the cook," Graves said, recognition dawning in his expression. "Or rather, you're whoever was pretending to be the cook. Force Recon, I'm guessing, based on how you moved during the takedown." "Captain Sarah," she confirmed. "And you're right, I was undercover in the mess hall for 3 months, watching everything and everyone, including you on the occasions when you made deliveries to the base." Graves studied her with professional interest. "I never made you as anything other than what you appeared to be. That's impressive." "Thank you. Now let me tell you what I observed during those 3 months, because I think it will help you understand the position you're actually in." Sarah pulled out a tablet and brought up a series of photographs and documents. "You made 7 deliveries to Fob Atlas during my time here. On 4 of those occasions, you met privately with Lieutenant in the supply area. On 2 occasions, you passed packages to in locations you thought weren't covered by security cameras." Graves's expression remained neutral, but Sarah could see the slight tension in his jaw that indicated she had his attention. "But what you didn't know is that we installed additional surveillance specifically because of the convoy attacks. Every one of those meetings was recorded. We have video, audio, and transaction records showing the exact nature of your operation." She slid several photographs across the table, showing Graves in compromising situations with both and. "We also have forensic accountants going through every financial transaction associated with your company and your personal accounts. They've already traced approximately $8 million to offshore accounts, and they're just getting started." Sarah paused, letting that information sink in. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to prison for a very long time. The only question is whether you spend that time in general population or in protective custody, and whether your sentence is life without parole or whether there's a possibility of ever seeing freedom again." Harrison had caught on to Sarah's approach and seamlessly picked up the thread. "The $8 million we've traced is going to be seized as proceeds of criminal activity. But if there's more money hidden somewhere, money that could be recovered and returned to the government, that might be worth considering in sentencing recommendations." Graves was silent for a long moment, his mind clearly working through his options. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "There's more money, a lot more, and there are assets, equipment stockpiles, and safe houses scattered across 4 countries, but I want guarantees about my safety and my sentence before I give you any of that." "We can guarantee that you'll be protected from retaliation by your former associates," Harrison said. "And we can recommend to the court that your cooperation be taken into consideration during sentencing. But immunity is completely off the table, and you need to understand that going in." Sarah watched the calculation happening behind Graves's eyes, the weighing of options and outcomes that any experienced operator went through when facing impossible choices. She had been in similar situations herself, not as a prisoner, but as an operator having to make hard decisions with incomplete information. The difference was that her choices had been made in service to her country, while Graves had chosen to betray it. "I need something to write with," Graves finally said, the fight going out of his voice. "This is going to take a while." Over the next 12 hours, Michael Graves provided information that dismantled what turned out to be the largest military theft and espionage network in the Afghan theater. The scope was staggering. Over $40 million in stolen equipment and supplies, safe houses in Pakistan, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates, and a network of compromised personnel that extended beyond just military members to include contractors, interpreters, and even local government officials. The revelation that shocked everyone the most was the identity of Graves himself. His real name was, and he had been a CIA operations officer who had gone rogue 6 years earlier, using his intelligence training and connections to build a criminal empire that exploited the chaos of war for personal profit. He had recruited the deserters not out of ideology, but because they were useful assets who could facilitate his theft operations, while their supposed deaths provided perfect cover stories. Sarah sat in on most of the debriefings, her 3 months of observation providing context for the information Graves was revealing. She could connect dots that others might have missed, identifying patterns in his operations and methods that suggested even more extensive activities than he was initially admitting to. As dawn broke on the second day of Graves's cooperation, Sarah finally allowed herself to leave the intelligence center and get some real sleep. She walked back to her quarters through a base that was slowly returning to normal operations, though everyone now understood that normal had been compromised for far longer than anyone wanted to admit. Maria caught up with her near the mess hall, her expression a mixture of relief and confusion. "So you're really not a cook?" Sarah smiled tiredly. "I'm really not a cook, sorry for the deception." "Don't apologize, you helped stop something terrible. I just wish I had known what to look for earlier. Maybe I could have helped more." "You helped more than you know," Sarah assured her. "The information about Graves was the break we needed. You may have saved lives by coming forward when you did." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Maria spoke again. "So what happens now? Do you go back to whatever it is you really do, or do you stay here and keep pretending to cook?" Sarah laughed, the sound feeling strange after the intensity of the past few days. "I think my cooking days are over. There's going to be a lot of follow-up work, tracking down all the assets Graves mentioned, coordinating with law enforcement in multiple countries. This investigation is just beginning, not ending." What Sarah didn't mention was that she had already been approached about a new assignment, one that would take her even deeper into the shadowy world of counterintelligence and covert operations. The success of her undercover work at FOB Atlas had proven that she had skills beyond combat operations, and there were plenty of other situations where someone who could become invisible while gathering intelligence would be valuable. But for now, she just wanted to sleep in a bed without being ready to respond to an alert at any moment, to eat a meal she hadn't prepared herself, and to process everything that had happened 6 weeks after the capture of. Sarah found herself in Istanbul, Turkey, walking through the ancient streets of the district with a purpose that had nothing to do with sightseeing. The information had provided during his extensive debriefings had led to this moment, to a safe house he claimed contained critical intelligence materials and a significant cache of stolen military equipment that hadn't yet been sold on the black market. The operation had expanded far beyond FOB Atlas, pulling in resources from multiple agencies and governments. The FBI had jurisdiction over American citizens involved in the conspiracy. The CIA was handling the international aspects, and various military intelligence units were tracking down the stolen equipment. Sarah had been asked to stay involved because of her unique understanding of how House Network operated, and because her Force Recon background made her ideally suited for the kind of direct action that might be required. Her partner for this phase of the operation was a Turkish National Intelligence Organization officer named, a woman in her early 30s who spoke 5 languages fluently and had a reputation for being both brilliant and absolutely fearless. They had met 3 days earlier in a secure facility outside Istanbul, and despite the usual interagency tensions that complicated international operations, they had quickly developed a working rapport based on mutual professional respect. "The building is ahead on the right," said, her English carrying only the slightest accent. "3rd floor, apartment 7. According to building records, it's been rented to a German businessman named for the past 2 years, but our surveillance has never seen anyone matching that description enter or exit." Sarah studied the building as they approached, automatically cataloging entry points, escape routes, and potential complications. It was a nondescript apartment complex in a middle-class neighborhood, exactly the kind of place that wouldn't attract attention from neighbors or authorities. Had chosen his locations well, hiding in plain sight among the millions of people who called Istanbul home. "What's the surveillance situation?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice low even though they were speaking in English amid a street full of Turkish conversations. "We have teams positioned with eyes on all exits. If anyone tries to leave once we enter, they'll be intercepted. But according to his information, the apartment should be empty. He claims he's the only person who knew about this particular safe house." "You believe him?" Sarah didn't need to elaborate on why that might be a dangerous assumption. Shrugged with the fatalism of someone who had been in intelligence work long enough to know that certainty was a luxury. "I believe he doesn't want to spend the rest of his life in an American military prison. That gives him strong motivation to be truthful. But I also believe in being prepared for surprises." They entered the building through the main entrance like any other residence, climbing the stairs to the 3rd floor rather than using the elevator. The hallway was empty and quiet, most residents away at work during the late afternoon hours. Sarah paused outside apartment 7, listening for any sounds of occupation before produced a key that had provided along with his confession. The key turned smoothly in the lock, suggesting the apartment had been maintained even during months of apparent vacancy. Pushed the door open while Sarah covered the entrance with her concealed sidearm, both women moving with the synchronized efficiency of experienced operators conducting a tactical entry. The apartment was indeed empty of people, but it was far from empty of contents. What they found inside made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The main room had been converted into an intelligence operations center with computer equipment, filing cabinets, and what looked like enough communication gear to run a small embassy. One entire wall was covered with maps and photographs, showing military installations across Afghanistan, Iraq, and several other countries where American forces were deployed. "This is much more extensive than described," said, already photographing the wall displays with her phone. "This looks like a full intelligence collection operation, not just a theft and smuggling network." Sarah moved to the filing cabinets, finding them unlocked and full of meticulously organized documents. Personnel files on American military members, detailed information about supply chains and logistics, security assessments of various installations, and what appeared to be recruitment dossiers on potential assets. The scope of this operation was becoming clearer, and it was far more sophisticated than anyone had initially suspected. But it was what Sarah found in the second bedroom that truly revealed the depth of the conspiracy. The room had been set up as a document reproduction center, with high-end printers, scanners, and laminating equipment. And stored in boxes along one wall were hundreds of blank military identification cards, official forms and letterhead from various units, and even some completed false identities that had apparently never been used. "Wasn't just stealing equipment and recruiting deserters," Sarah said, the implications hitting her like a physical blow. "He was creating an entire shadow network of people who could move freely through military installations with legitimate-looking credentials. This is counterintelligence nightmare material." Had entered the room behind her and was examining the equipment with growing alarm. If even a fraction of these false identities were deployed, there could be hostile actors operating inside American military facilities right now, and no one would know they didn't belong there. Sarah pulled out her encrypted phone and contacted, who was coordinating the follow-up investigations from a secure facility in Germany. "We've got a major problem. Istanbul's safe house contains enough material to create hundreds of false military identities. We need to assume that some of these have already been used and implement immediate security protocols." The response came back within minutes. All American military installations worldwide were being placed on heightened alert. Identification verification procedures were being enhanced, and criminal investigators were beginning the painstaking process of auditing personnel records to identify anyone who might be using false credentials. The discovery in Istanbul was just the beginning. Over the next several weeks, as Sarah and various international law enforcement agencies followed the leads from safe houses, the true scope of his operation became apparent. He hadn't just been stealing military equipment or recruiting deserters. He had been building a sophisticated intelligence network that sold information to the highest bidder, created false identities for criminals and terrorists, and facilitated illegal activities across multiple continents. Safe houses in Dubai, Karachi, and Frankfurt yielded similar intelligence hauls. In each location, they found evidence of ongoing operations that had been running, some of which had been active for years without detection. The man had been living multiple lives simultaneously, using different identities and cover stories to compartmentalize his activities so that no single exposure could bring down the entire network. But despite these successes, something still bothered Sarah. Cooperation had been almost too complete, too willing once he had decided to talk. He had given them everything they asked for, provided detailed information about operations and assets, and had seemed almost relieved to unburden himself of the secrets he had been carrying. It didn't match the profile of a hardened intelligence officer who had successfully run clandestine operations for 6 years. Her suspicions were confirmed during a follow-up interrogation 3 months after his initial capture. Sarah had returned to the United States for the session, wanting to ask some questions that had been nagging at her since Istanbul. Looked different now, thinner and paler from months of confinement, but his eyes still held the same calculating intelligence that had made him dangerous in the first place. "You gave us everything too easily," Sarah said without preamble, sitting across from him in the familiar interrogation room. You're too smart to have cracked so quickly, too experienced to have just given up. So what aren't you telling us? Smiled, a genuine expression that actually reached his eyes for the first time since his capture. I was wondering when someone would figure that out. I've been waiting for you specifically, actually. You're the one who put all the pieces together at Fob Atlas, the one who maintained cover for 3 months without breaking character once. I knew you'd be the one to see what everyone else was missing. So enlighten me, Sarah said, keeping her voice neutral even as her mind raced through possibilities. Everything I've told you is true, began, leaning back in his chair. The safe houses, the stolen equipment, the false identities, all of it. But what I didn't tell you is that I wasn't the top of the network. I was middle management, running operations for someone else, someone who has significantly more resources and reach than I ever did. The room went completely silent. Harrison, who had been observing from the adjacent room, immediately entered and took a seat beside Sarah. You're telling us there's someone above you in this organization. Not just someone, multiple someones. I was recruited 8 years ago by what I thought was a private intelligence contractor looking for people with my skill set. They offered me 3 times what the CIA was paying, complete operational autonomy, and the backing to build networks in regions where official channels couldn't operate. It seemed like a perfect opportunity for someone who was frustrated with bureaucratic limitations. Paused, seemingly organizing his thoughts. It took me 2 years to realize that the organization wasn't just a private contractor. It was something much bigger, much more sophisticated. They had assets inside multiple governments, including our own. They had access to intelligence that even I couldn't get through official channels when I was still with the CIA. And they had an agenda that went far beyond simple profit. What kind of agenda? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Chaos, replied simply. They profit from instability, from conflict, from the breakdown of traditional power structures. Every weapon system I stole and sold ended up in the hands of groups that would use them to destabilize regions. Every piece of intelligence I gathered was used to manipulate events in ways that benefited their investments. They're not trying to win wars. They're trying to ensure that wars never end. Harrison's expression had gone from skeptical to deeply concerned. You're describing a conspiracy theory that sounds like something out of a bad thriller novel. I thought the same thing when I first figured it out, said. But then I started documenting everything, keeping records that even they didn't know about. Insurance, you might call it. And when your captain started getting too close at Fob Atlas, when I realized the entire operation was going to be exposed, I made a decision to bring the whole thing down rather than let them use me as a scapegoat. He looked directly at Sarah. The information I've given you about my operations is real and accurate, but it's also incomplete. The safe houses you've been raiding, the evidence you've been collecting, it's all designed to lead you to the next level. I've been giving you breadcrumbs, and you've been following them exactly as I hoped you would. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. How do we know this isn't just another manipulation, another layer of deception? Because I'm going to give you something I've never given anyone else. The location of my real insurance files, the evidence I've been collecting for the past 4 years that proves everything I'm telling you. Pulled out a piece of paper that had been hidden in his prison uniform and slid it across the table. This is the access code to an encrypted server that contains thousands of documents, communications intercepts, and financial records that trace the network all the way to the top. Harrison picked up the paper, examining it with suspicion. And why would you give us this now, after 3 months of cooperation that you're claiming was a carefully orchestrated deception? Because I'm dying, said quietly. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, I've known for 6 months. The prison doctors confirmed it last week. I have maybe 90 days left, probably less. I wanted to make sure I completed what I started before it's too late. The revelation stunned both Sarah and Harrison into momentary silence. Continued, his voice growing weaker as if the admission had taken something vital from him. I may have committed crimes, terrible crimes, but I did them believing I was working for something worthwhile. When I realized I had been used to make the world worse instead of better, I knew I had to find a way to make it right. Getting caught at Fob Atlas gave me that opportunity. Assuming what you're telling us is true, Sarah said carefully, what exactly are we going to find on this server? Names, replied. High-ranking officials in multiple governments who are part of the network. Financial institutions that launder money and facilitate illegal transactions. Defense contractors who deliberately sell faulty equipment to prolong conflicts. media organizations that spread propaganda designed to increase tensions between nations. It's all there, documented with the kind of detail that only someone inside the organization could have compiled. Over the next 72 hours, a specialized team from the NSA worked to access the encrypted server using the credentials it provided. The process was complicated by multiple layers of security and fail-safes designed to destroy the data if anyone attempted unauthorized access. But eventually, they broke through, and what they found was exactly what it promised: a comprehensive archive of evidence documenting a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of power across multiple countries. Sarah was granted access to portions of the archive, and what she read made her question everything she thought she understood about the conflicts she had fought in. The evidence suggested that attacks had been allowed to happen, that intelligence had been deliberately or manipulated, and that American soldiers had died not because of enemy action, but because of calculated decisions made by people who profited from prolonged warfare. The implications were staggering and politically explosive. Exposing the conspiracy would require careful handling at the highest levels of government to avoid triggering international incidents or domestic political upheaval. Sarah found herself pulled into meetings with officials whose names she had only seen in classified briefings, people who operated at stratospheric levels of the intelligence and defense communities. "We need to be very careful about how we proceed with this information," a deputy director whose name Sarah wasn't allowed to know told her during one such meeting. "If we move too fast or too publicly, we risk tipping off the people involved and losing our chance to dismantle the network completely. But if we move too slowly, we risk more American lives being lost while we gather evidence." Sarah understood the dilemma, but she also understood the cost of inaction. Every day we wait, soldiers are being put at risk by people who are supposed to be protecting them. I didn't spend 3 months undercover just to watch this information get buried because it's politically inconvenient. "No one is suggesting we bury anything," the deputy director replied, though his expression suggested that was exactly what some people were suggesting. "But we need a coordinated strategy that allows us to take down the entire network simultaneously. That's going to take time and resources." The strategy that emerged over the following weeks was unprecedented in its scope. Multiple agencies across several countries coordinated to build cases against the individuals identified in its archive. Some were arrested quietly, their crimes kept from public view to avoid alerting others in the network. Others were put under surveillance, their communications monitored, and their activities tracked as investigators built comprehensive cases that would stand up in court. Sarah's role in the operation evolved from operator to coordinator, using her understanding of SM's methods and the intelligence he had provided to help identify targets and plan operations. It was different from the direct action she was accustomed to, but no less important. Every conspiracy member they removed from power was one less person manipulating events for profit, one less threat to the soldiers serving in combat zones around the world. Died in federal custody 4 months after his initial capture, his pancreatic cancer progressing exactly as the doctors had predicted. Sarah attended his funeral at his request, watching as the man who had betrayed his country was buried without honors or recognition. There were only a handful of people there, some prison officials, Harrison representing the intelligence community, and Sarah herself. Did he really think this would redeem him? Sarah asked Harrison as they stood in the rain watching his coffin being lowered into the ground. "I think he knew redemption wasn't possible," Harrison replied. "But he gave us the tools to prevent others from making the same mistakes he did. That's something, at least." 2 years after the events at FOB Atlas, Sarah sat in a congressional hearing room, testifying in a closed session about the conspiracy that had been uncovered and the operations that had dismantled it. The investigation had resulted in over 200 arrests across 18 countries, the recovery of more than $300 million in stolen assets, and significant reforms to military contracting and security procedures. But despite these successes, Sarah knew the work was far from complete. The network that had exposed had been extensive, but it almost certainly wasn't the only one. Where there was money to be made from conflict and chaos, there would always be people willing to exploit the system for personal gain. As she left the hearing room, her phone buzzed with a message from "New assignment if you're interested. Might involve some cooking." Sarah smiled at the reference to her undercover work. Whatever the new assignment was, it would likely be challenging, possibly dangerous, and definitely important. That was the nature of the work she had chosen, the path she had committed to when she first raised her right hand and swore to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. She typed back a simple response, "When do I start?" 3 months later, Sarah was working in a small in Berlin, serving coffee and pastries to customers while watching and listening for signs of a new network that intelligence had identified operating in Eastern Europe. She had become someone different again, her military bearing hidden beneath the friendly demeanor of a service worker, her combat skills concealed by her role as just another person trying to make a living in a foreign city. The soldiers who had known her at Fob Atlas, who had eaten meals she prepared and never suspected she was anything other than a cook, had moved on to new assignments and new challenges. Most of them never knew the truth about who she really was or what she had accomplished during those 3 months. They just remembered her as the woman who made good scrambled eggs and always had a kind word for everyone who passed through the mess hall. Maria, the actual cook who had worked alongside her, sometimes thought about Sarah and wondered what had happened to her. She had heard rumors that the quiet woman who had worked in the kitchen had been involved in some kind of major security operation, but the details were classified and the rumors varied wildly. Maria hoped that wherever Sarah was, whatever she was doing, she was safe and successful. In Berlin, Sarah served coffee to a businessman who was suspected of facilitating illegal weapons sales, smiled at a diplomat who might be selling classified information, and listened to conversations that might contain the clues she needed to unravel another conspiracy. She was patient, observant, and completely committed to her mission. They knew her as the worker who made excellent lattes and remembered everyone's usual order. They had no idea that the woman serving them coffee was a force reconnaissance Marine who had taken down a multinational criminal conspiracy and saved countless lives. And that was exactly how Sarah preferred it, invisible and underestimated, right up until the moment she needed to be neither. The work continued, the mission evolved, and Sarah remained in the shadows where she was most effective, serving her country in ways that would never be publicly recognized, but that made all the difference to the soldiers who depended on people like her to keep them safe. She was a force Recon Marine, whether she was wearing combat gear or an apron, and that would never change no matter what role she played. In the end, that was what mattered most, not the recognition or the glory, but the knowledge that she was making a difference, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and ensuring that people like and the network he had served could never again put American lives at risk for profit. It was quiet work, often invisible, but it was the most important work Sarah could imagine doing. And somewhere in the world, there was another mess hall, another base, another group of soldiers eating meals prepared by someone they would never suspect was anything other than what they appeared to be. The work never ended, but neither did Sarah's commitment to it. She had found her purpose in the shadows, and she would continue to serve there for as long as she was needed, one mission at a time, one conspiracy at a time, making the world a little bit safer with each operation she completed. The customers in Berlin would never know her real story, just as the soldiers at Fob Atlas had never known. And that was exactly how it should be, because the best intelligence operations were the ones that never made headlines, the ones that quietly protected people without them ever knowing they had been in danger. Sarah had become a master of that art, and she would continue to perfect it for as long as her country needed her skills. They knew her as the worker in Berlin, just as they had known her as the mess hall cook at Fob Atlas. But Sarah knew herself as something much more important, a guardian in the shadows, a force Recon Marine who had never stopped serving, and a woman who had found her calling in the quiet work of keeping others safe. That was her true identity, and no cover story could ever change the past 3 months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new missions, but today she was just Captain Sarah, a force Recon Marine who had stopped being a cooktie. There were more possibly American personnel who had completely turned, who weren't just feeding information but actively fighting alongside the enemy. The network was deeper and more dangerous than anyone had suspected. Sarah's role in the operation was about to change dramatically. Tomorrow, she would stop being a cook and return to being what she really was, a force reconnaissance Marine, ready to face whatever enemy forces were waiting in that valley.